Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining for this afternoon session where we're going to take it a little bit from the policy perspective that we were focused on this morning in the big auditorium to bring it down to the level of practice. My name is Dana Schmidt. For those of you who weren't with us this morning, I'm a senior program officer with Echidna Giving. And I'm joined today by three wonderful panelists. So we have directly to my left is Kim Folds, who's Senior Director of International Research and Evaluation at Sesame Workshop. Next to her is Joan Lombardi, who's the Director of Early Opportunities. And last, but certainly not least, is Samyukta Subramanian, who is, of course, an Echidna Global Scholar this year, and is also the Program Head of Early Childhood Education at Pratham, which is a large NGO based in India. So as I said, this morning what we really focused on was thinking about the policy environment for early childhood education in India, and how to think about a gendered perspective in early childhood education. And this afternoon, what we want to dig into is on how that can be done. So how do we translate from policy down and into practice? And what I want to start with, actually, Joan, a question for you, which is, given your long experience in the early childhood development sector, what have you learned about who some of the key stakeholders are for making things work in early childhood development and how you reach them?
Okay, well, great. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm really delighted to be here. Got it. Push a button is hard. I'm sorry I missed this morning because one of my favorite people, Vrinda Datta, who I've learned so much from over the years, spoke, and I got to catch up a little bit. Before I answer your stakeholder question, though, I want to congratulate you first. Congratulations on doing this, and to Dana for supporting this work. I think when Dana first called me, I've been in the field of early childhood for more years than I can count. And when Dana first called me about this topic, do you remember this? I said, it wasn't that long ago, I said, oh, gender is not, it's not an issue, we have access in early childhood. But I'm glad you're interested in young children. So how wrong was I? Because I took a very narrow focus on the issue. And I think what this report does is tell us, well, of course, that was the wrong thing to just think about access and equal access of early childhood, where we do have more parity than in the rest of the education world. And so I think this report, first of all, is timely for three reasons. First, the field of early childhood is just exploding all over the place, but there has not been a focus on this issue the way it should, and the way I think she did in this report. Secondly, that we've got much more focus on equity right now, so it's timely that we're talking about this issue. And third, because of what you heard this morning, the changes in India, the potential, and I say potential because until there's resources, it's just potential, to really make a difference on the early childhood side, which we've been waiting a very long time. I think the biggest breakthrough in the report, before I talk about stakeholders, is the notion of transformation. That wonderful graph that she has in there that really talks about gender responsiveness, gender neutrality, moving towards transformation, and a much more active approach to the issue, which I think has a lot of implications for practice. And we're seeing that with regards to race and ethnicity also, which I think we should talk about a little bit with regards to gender and the integration of gender and race. I think what's exciting to me about this report from the practice side is the comprehensive nature of it. that it talks about curriculum, that it talks about teacher preparation, that it talks about the home as much as the school. It talks about community and technology, and we can have a whole conversation about what the implications of that are for the tools that you should go home and develop based on the report. So Dana, to your question, I think that because early childhood is such a broad topic and it crosses sectors, we need all the stakeholders that are out there, because we always say it has three mothers: health, learning, and behavior, or it has no mothers. And so no one really owns it. And so I think the way that I've always felt about stakeholders and reaching out to stakeholders is to stay open and not try to control them, but take them from where they are, right? And move them forward around the importance of young children from whatever platform they're in. So that's a long answer to a short question. Sorry.
That's great. And as you said, there are many different stakeholders within early childhood, some of whom are critical, and this came up this morning as well, are the other parents of young children. And I wanted to turn to you, Kim, around your experience with Sesame and how, in your work both on television and in radio, how you've thought about engaging beyond just the child and with the broader community, including with parents.
Great. Thanks, Dana. Hi, everyone. As Dana mentioned, at Sesame, we try to create what we call the enabling environment, starting with mass media as an entry point. And so often in many of the countries we work, that's through mass media, whether it be a television show or a radio program where television is less accessible to many families. And what we do is that we have found that Muppets allow us to be someone we're not always comfortable being. Muppets allow us to talk about things that are sometimes very difficult to talk about, and that's children and adults alike. If we had a Muppet walk in here, surprise, no, we would all sort of kind of become children again. And the same is true for children as well. There's a sort of displacement where Muppets can broach culturally difficult topics. And so how we do this in our programming is that we create the enabling environment starting with mass media, and then we work with partners on the ground who know communities far better than we do, and we provide content to help them address these topics. And so we do this through workshops, through ECD centers, through listening circles, through which we incorporate television program, radio program, print materials that draw in both parents and children alike. And in a lot of the countries where we work, we know, for example, at home, parents are watching TV with their children. So in Afghanistan, we have a television show, Bacha Simsim, and more than 80% of television-owning households watch Bacha Simsim. We have what we call co-viewership, where parents and children watch together, and it's in the 80% percentile as well. And so that we know this is a really important opportunity for us to be able to reach parents as well as children around all kinds of different messaging, including around challenging some gender norms. So that's one of the key ways. And in areas where we don't necessarily have a television presence, we do a lot of work with our partner World Vision through water, health, and sanitation in a lot of rural communities across the world. We're in countries where people don't know Sesame Street or whatever the local co-production is. We've still found that Muppets are still a really important entry point. It doesn't take a long time for children to become really close with Muppets that look like them, that sound like them, and that are dealing with a lot of similar issues that they deal with. And so in those cases, we still provide that sort of enabling environment through a much more concentrated way, in which it's really important for us to include parents, community leaders, all of those key figures in young children's lives.
Can you give us some concrete examples of the types of gender norms the Muppets are able to challenge?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in Afghanistan, which I think is probably where we've done most of our work internationally, we have focused primarily initially on representation. And for us, representation has been a really key starting point to, again, build that relationship with the community. And so our Afghan Muppet, Zari, she loves sports. And we've seen in evaluations that we've run on the television show that through her modeling, playing cricket, playing football, different kinds of sports, that we've actually seen some changes in beliefs around girls' ability to play sports at a young age. We also, I was just in Zimbabwe last week looking at one of our projects, Wash Up Girl Talk, in which we are supporting changes in knowledge and behavior around puberty and menstrual health management for girls and boys, a bit older, ages 10 to 14. And what I saw there was incredibly powerful, and I hate to use these sort of hyperbolic statements, but there were parent support groups where there were fathers talking about how they did not want the program at first. They openly said that they were worried that this project would make their daughters promiscuous. If now they're talking about periods and their boys are getting this information, and now they're standing in a group talking about periods and making reusable menstrual pads, and parents from neighboring schools are coming over wishing that they also had this programming and how can we expand it. And so that for us, even though that was not an initiative that we would consider part of our gender equity programming, it was absolutely challenging gender norms.
Great, thank you. So Samyukta, turning to you, one of the things that your research, and for those of you who haven't read the full report that we're referring to, I hope this is enough of a teaser that you'll grab a copy and really dig in, because we're scratching the surface. But one of the things that you really highlight in your report is the role of mothers, obviously, in shaping their young children, but also then the relationship with the Anganwadi worker and her, often her role, and her role and extending into the community. So can you talk a little bit about kind of the role of mother, the role of Anganwadi worker, where one begins, where the other ends?
Sure. But before I get into that, I have to talk a little bit about this program through which the Anganwadi actually came about. The ICDS, or the Integrated Child Development Services Scheme, rolled out across India in the early 70s. And the idea was to have community-based preschool centers in such a way that each center reaches out to about 250 homes, mothers there. And today, the program is probably one of the largest in the world. It reaches out to about 1.3 million Anganwadi, children. 1.3 Anganwadis are actually spread out across India, and that number is increasing. And the program, what it tries to do is, it tries to look at the health and nutrition of women. It looks at adolescent girls and educating them, health education and awareness. It talks about referral services, which means if there's a problem, where do you take your children, adolescent girls or mothers? It talks about immunization, which means providing, the polio drops and other things on time. And it talks about early childhood education. And the one person who does all of this at the Anganwadi is the Anganwadi worker. We don't even call her a teacher, but she is actually the first teacher for every woman in that community. Whether it's the child, the mother, or the community, there's this lady who's taking care of all the health needs of the women there. And almost before, it's almost like as soon as the child comes into the stomach of the mother, it's actually this lady who starts saying, where are you going to have your child? What are the medicines you're having? What are the vitamins that lactating mothers need? And when we go into the Anganwadi, like for instance, when I went, she would say, oh, this lady, because I was looking for the mother of the preschool child. So she would know where that mother is having her second child, which, sometimes even the fathers wouldn't know, where the wife is, but the teacher would, she'd be like, oh, she had a fight today. She's gone to this one's house. Or, she's decided to have her baby at her mom's place and not at her mother-in-law's place, which says a lot, So it's this teacher who, she would know all these little details about these communities. And I think that's where that bond, that connection is formed. And So when it comes to this program provides food free of cost to every person who walks into that community center. So mothers would often come in to say, with a bowl for the child who's attending the preschool, but also for a bowl for all the food that her other children at home need. And so you can see there's this bond which is not just need-based, but an emotional bond which is already there. And that's why I feel that this is something that we can build off of. I'm not sure, I've worked with schools also in India, but I'm not sure that school teachers share this bond with mothers. I think this is a very special bond, and so that's why we really need to think about who in the community connects in such a way that they can then influence what people are thinking.
And so, I mean, it strikes me as you're listing all of the things that the Anganwadi worker does, that she's expected to almost be a miracle worker at very low pay, as I understand. And just building off of Joan's point, I mean, if we're adding to her list of duties, transforming gender attitudes, that's a big ask, right? So building off of Joan's point about meeting stakeholders where they're at, are there things that you see as kind of the easy, low-hanging fruit in terms of the first place to meet the Anganwadi worker and help her in this journey to kind of support greater gender equality?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. She is a miracle person. She has this person who helps her. She's known as the Anganwadi helper with the food and everything. But rather than say that you need to do this one additional task, I feel like she has numerous conversations with people in the community. And it's not a forced conversation. But how do we channelize that conversation in such a way that we change attitudes and mindsets? And of course, we need to begin with that Anganwadi teacher and to see what she's doing and how she's doing it. But I feel like she's with the child in the class and she's with the moms in their journey. And so that conversation, which is anyway happening, how do we influence that? So.
Yeah. Well, it's very interesting to think about the ICDS program. How many of you are familiar with the ICDS program in India? Most of you? Few of you? I mean, it is the biggest in the world early childhood program, without a doubt. I ran the National Head Start program here in the U.S., and I thought it was a lot that I had 1 million children. Let alone how many million children the Anganwadi system is serving. So it is a very important gateway to all of these issues. One thing I think we should think about when we think about gender equity is the gender equity for her. Because one of the reasons she's so low paid is because she is so low paid. And so the traditional work of early childhood is a gender equity issue in and of itself that I think we have to begin to recognize. I have so much respect for the potential of Sesame Street and what they can do and what they have been doing, and congratulations on everything you've been doing. I think the way we approach parents, I'm a little bit concerned about the way we approach parents in general lately, because we're acting like they're empty glasses of water and we just fill them up with information and then they're going to be transformed, rather than supporting them, empowering them, and reaching out to the fathers. And I was so glad you mentioned that. I mean, to me, one of the most gender transforming efforts going on is the Men Care campaign, which Promundo has launched and is doing it in early childhood programs. So I think we need a whole new think about parent involvement, parent engagement that's more empowering.
I have 2 questions. I'm going to go in 2 directions at once. I'm going to start, Joan, with just a follow-up on that, because you talk about sort of the gender issues for the Anganwadi worker, and the other actor in the system that comes to mind is the mother, right, who is often left with the primary care responsibilities. And one of the questions that came up in the morning session was around whether thinking more broadly about early childhood in terms of not just leaning on mothers to do more for the development of children, but providing services that can like childcare that can really unleash mother's opportunity to then work and not have more on her plate, but have a broader support for her own well-being and for that of her children. Can you say more? I know you've have some experience with mobile creche in India, and can you say more about that model and what that and the ways in which they engage with parents, which is brings in, I think, another dimension to the conversation.
So Mobile Creche is a childcare program that emerged and does a lot of work around construction sites and other venues that women are now coming into urban areas and working in, and more in rural areas also. What's interesting to me about childcare is the dichotomy between preschool and childcare. And so let's take the case of India now, where there's real interest in pre-primary. I'm sure that was talked about this morning. But if we create pre-primary programs that are 3 or 4 hours a day, they don't fit with the needs of working families. So in every one of these, and I've seen that happen here and I've seen it happen all around the world, because one is thought of as education and one is thought of as a work support for women, when in fact they're both settings for young children where you can promote learning. And so you've got to have a gender lens to all of these policies. Otherwise, I think what seems like you're doing something positive for children may become more difficult for parents. And you don't want to pull people out of a program like Mobile Creche, which is a wonderful quality program, and put them in a 3-hour preschool. Doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, thank you. The other thread I wanted to pick up on is this point about fathers. And Kim, I know that Sesame has also been thinking a little bit about father engagement, particularly in South Africa, and I wondered if you could share a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. We, through our partnership with Lego Foundation for the last couple of years, we have been looking at caregivers' knowledge around the value of play as part of children's healthy development, cognitive, physical, socio-emotional. And to Joan's point, assuming that parents are empty vessels is not the way to go. So through a series of needs assessments, we found that many parents do know that play is an integral part of how children learn. It's the way that young children learn. But play is women's business. Women play with children. This is not a space for men. And so when we factor all of these things in, that childcare is considered a women's domain, play is a women's domain, play is how children learn, right? So there's all these different points in this thread. And so we have some work now where in South Africa, we've held a series of play workshops to support caregiver confidence in their role, providing play opportunities and playful learning moments. Because even though we found that parents knew the value of play, they didn't feel confident in their ability to deliver those moments. And so we carried out a series of play workshops to just support that. They were almost exclusively attended by women, mothers, aunties, grannies, other primary women caregivers in children's lives. And so because of the value of including fathers, we are moving forward now with having fathers-only play workshops to really pull fathers in to see how important their role in their children's healthy development, that fathers playing with their children is a part of a long-term healthy pathway for many reasons, for children's long-term success, for children's economic success, socio-emotional success, right? The list goes on and on. And so this is very new work, but we are really excited. And a lot of it's coming from what we're learning from what others are doing in these spaces on how fathers have to be engaged in these moments.
Is there a father Muppet?
There is a father. Is this on? Elmo's father, Louis. He's international now, and a lot we do have a lot of caregiver-facing video where Louis models these sort of behaviors. We also have a series called I Heart Elmo, which is largely focused on socio-emotional and child protection, and it's moments with Elmo with his parents, but mostly with his father, and his father sort of models that nurturing care. And what we hear is that mothers love it. They love it so much, even if there is not a male role model in their children's lives. because it is modeling that behavior through Muppets. Again, Muppets present these opportunities that it's very difficult to represent with regular folks like you and I.
That's great. Samyukta, in your research and report, you kind of draw out some thoughts about father engagement and this particularly around this technology piece. And I wondered if you wanted to unpack that a little more.
Yeah, so the fathers, I talked about this in the technology piece because I said that, I did find that there are cell phones at home. But the internet phone, which is the smartphone, the fathers often had that. And so that's why, children would wait for their fathers to come home because then they could play games on the smartphone. So they could access games basically on the phone. And when I asked mothers of preschool children, do your husband and your child spend time together? They would say yes. They watch television together, or they play games on the phone together. And some of them would say, my husband doesn't have time. Like, he's busy outdoors all day, so, there's really no time. So I think one, there isn't much time spent between, with the child, the young child and the father. And two, the quality of time spent is poor in my opinion, because when you watch television, it's not like it's not active engagement. Everyone's just happy that everyone's quiet, So, okay, and with children, no, but it's true with children. I think the whole day you're dealing with them and they're crying and you have to get them to play. And here's this thing that comes along where everyone's like, oh my God, what's happening? And what is it that's happening on TV, or what is that game on the phone? I don't think any of us really know. But we know for a fact that this is already in their systems. It's all over. And I've seen that, in the olden days, we would give toffees to children, just to keep them quiet and so on. Now the bribe is, the phone. The minute the phone comes in the hand, so I feel like this piece between fathers, technology, and children, that's something that we really need to explore.
Do you want to come in?
I agree. TV can be a very static medium, certainly. And I think that's not just in countries outside of the U.S., right? Many of us rely on television to...
That's true.
Oh, wait, here. Okay, my bad.
Sorry, can you hear me now? I was just saying that TV is a very static medium, and I think for our formats, because we have seen this, and we don't want TV in this case to be something that's just a time waste. We want it to be an educational moment, because we do know that parents are going to put their children in front of the screen, whether it's a smartphone or a television or whatever it may be. So a lot of our formats now have become more interactive, where it's call and response, where a Muppet will say, how many lions do you see, or something, something along those lines. And we really do want it to be much more engaging. And again, the television show is seen as an entry point for us. It's not intended to be a end-all be-all of the experience. We want it to be an entry point for us to have these more high-touch, mediated experiences, absolutely. But I absolutely hear your concerns, and we don't want that experience either for young children, just to be something where they just kind of sit glassy-eyed in front of the television. We want it to be a really highly valuable experience for both parents and children.
One of the points that
I'm just sitting here thinking that we all of us that are parents in the room remember us using media in that way. I sitting here thinking that myself, and I used to put my son in front of video, there wasn't cell phones then, videos of Raffi. Does anybody remember Raffi? He was a musician, right? Well, my son ended up a musician. So I always figure that maybe he got something good out of that, but that wasn't my point. That was an aside, just to allay my guilt, because we all do it, One thing that I've learned on the father engagement part is it's kind of what you're doing with Lego and the purposeful workshops for fathers, is that you have to be intentional about it. And you have to design programs with them in mind. And in the beginning, it may be that they're separate. And that you have a male that's doing the male involvement. We found in Head Start that made a huge difference. And then you can do more integrated efforts. But I think in the beginning, to get fathers And men, it's not just fathers involved. We have to be more intentional and design programs for them.
One of the points that came up in the last panel, I think it was the differential in access to technology between men and women and youth. I think the statistic was male youth in India are 7 times more likely to have access. I could be misquoting this, but 7 times more likely to have access to the internet than women, young women. Are there any studies or data that you all know of around differential access for young children, and/or is that sort of a potential risk of leaning into the technology side?
No, I don't know of data with early years and little children. I don't know about that kind of data. That's probably because we are not looking at young users of data because the phone actually is in the hands of the parents. But in older years, I do know of boys having access to cell phones. And unfortunately, I also know of a community in Gujarat, and this was in the news recently, where the panchayat, the people, the local leaders of the community decided to ban cell phones for the girls. It was like a retrograde step, and that's why I know about it, because they said, this is what is corrupting our system and our society, and so, we're just not going to have phones, except that it was no phones for girls. So I think there are stereotypes around who can have access to information, and then, of course, there's information out there that boys have more access to than girls, and and then there are language barriers also. In the kind of material that one is seeing on any digital platform. And we need to be mindful of it, and more so for little kids, because I don't think there are conversations around what children are seeing with little kids, perhaps not even with older kids, but definitely not with little kids.
If I could, the data that we've seen, particularly working with displaced Syrians in the Middle East, is very much in line with this, is that they're a highly connected group, more so than many other displaced populations globally. But then when you dig a little deeper, it's, yes, there is a smartphone or some type of mobile phone in the community or in the household, but the father controls it. And so that's been an interesting point for us, because we are really trying to consider how digital platforms can be used to provide content to families. And so how can we, the only phrase that's coming to my mind is get around this, but that's not the right phrase that I want to use, but sort of how can we figure out a solution to get content to young children where television access may not be the way to go when fathers are the ones controlling the content. And another thing is also when you're looking at content that is working to ensure that girls also have access to a quality education. When we ask parents what they want from an early childhood education experience for their children, it's literacy and numeracy. Socio-emotional skills are not near the top. And so that's also sort of both of those things. How do we sort of present that this is a traditionally academic content to get parents to watch it on their smartphones to then let their children watch it? And so there's so many steps along the way, and we haven't figured it out yet, but we're still sort of iterating and working to try to figure out what the best solution is.
Great, thank you. So it's after lunch, and we thought that the best way to keep you engaged to actually turn the spotlight on you and ask you all to contribute to this conversation. So this is your warning that you need to sort of wake up your brains at this point. And the question to all of you is, given some of the issues that we've been talking about here on the panel in terms of how integral the family is for shaping gender norms in early childhood, what are the opportunities for actually being able to intervene in this space, and what are some examples, promising examples that you may have seen in your own work or experience? And there is a mic.
Hi, I'm Anissa. I'm an intern here with GCUS. I'm a student, a psychology student at FIU. And I had a quick question, kind of still in gender and ECD. So with my experience, I grew up in Mexico, and I remember, now that you guys are talking about technology, that we had a choice of like computer time growing up or outside time, and usually girls were not allowed to get the computer time. It was only guys. So I remember I would get really mad about that because I wanted computer time, but they wouldn't let me. So my question is, there's more. It's more likely for boys, let's say in India, to have access to technology than girls. So if there was access to technology to these girls, what would they do with it? Because they're still lacking that education and the literacy and numeracy. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but.
Great. Samyukta, do you want to take that? And actually, I'm in the awkward position as a moderator who's usually saying only ask questions to say, actually, we also want input and comments. So this is an opportunity for all of you who want to say something to make comments as well. But I don't know if you have any high level.
So, I mean, I think so what digital platforms do is that they don't follow a linear path. And I think that's why what a girl can do when she has access to that is something that you and I cannot predict. Just like we can't predict it for a boy. But to not have, it's like making, a decision in the absence of choices versus making the same decision in the presence of them. It's an informed choice, or it's an informed decision. And so I think the other thing about digital platforms is that you don't have to be dependent on, even if you cannot read. For instance, where I went into the under-resourced communities where I was working, or where I interviewed people, the mothers, the children that I saw, the preschool kids, are first-generation learners. So these mothers and fathers, many of them cannot read. And yet the phone is a medium through which, even if you cannot read, you can still understand and appreciate what's happening. So that's why today, if we look at the sort of backlash one sees, across the country for things that have happened, it's not because you're dependent on a newspaper to read. It's because there are videos that you can see and hear and react to. So I think the same would apply here.
Thanks. Okay, I see one here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a very interesting conversation and very educated. It has made me. I think we were discussing the father role and mother role a lot today, and today's discussion has given me an idea that the motherhood is probably it's probably too highlighted in our systems, especially in South Asia. Because the movies are for motherhood, the songs are for motherhood, the expectations are from motherhood, the doll in the hands of a girl is for the motherhood preparation. So when we grow up with this motherhood, as a woman, I'm saying, and I was a politician too, as I told you in my earlier session, for 10 years in Pakistan, I realized that all the time my motherhood was always my barrier. I have 4 kids. I've been a good mother, I think, as much as I could. But at the same time, I'm guilty, even today, after being whatever I could do for my mother-in-law, for my children, for my mother, everything, still my motherhood is guilty. What is this system which has educated me in this kind of a woman, though I was working for women empowerment, I was conducting elections. I was trying to encourage people in rural areas to go for girl education. Everything done. What about me? I still feel guilty. I'm not a good mother. So what is this motherhood concept? I think that I really need to know from someone that how do you explain? Probably you have a lot of experience, and maybe if you can tell me about this.
There's a simple answer to that, but I share that, and I think probably everybody in this room that has been a parent, a mother in this case, shares that sense that we constantly feel guilty about the multiple roles we play. I think it's going to take more and more equality in the home to change that. I mean, I still felt that way, and I had a very egalitarian husband. But I come from a very traditional Italian family. So it took a long time to get over the fact that I worked and that I worked when my children were very young. And I just think these things take generations, but I don't see the same level of kind of guilt over things in the next generation. Things are changing. I think things change. Just may take a long time.
Yeah. All right. I saw Nora over here, and then we'll come up.
Nowadays. Hi, Nora from Ongai. I wanted to raise a different issue. When some of us from Ongai were in Nigeria working with the northern states, maybe, 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, we held this is on sector planning, very boring, don't worry, I'll get to something more interesting. But we were having this side event on monitoring and evaluation. What was it? How do we do it? And something was about an indicator on the number of men in early childhood. And all of a sudden that spiraled off into this huge debate. And the Nigerian women were saying, well, why do we care about that anyway? Who wants to count the men in early childhood? They shouldn't be there. And I was really struck by that. Now, I'm Canadian, and in Canada, there are men teaching kindergarten, teaching 3- and 4-year-old boys how to get their shoes on and that kind of stuff. And that relates to what Joan referenced in terms of the men care movement. But in the school system, there's also, at least in Canada, a lot of anxiety about men as teachers of young children. And the teachers, the parents of the teachers, men teachers of children in kindergarten classes where there are men teachers, are nervous about it. And so there's a reality, maybe a tension between early childhood teaching, learning spaces where women have found, at least they've got some ownership there, like our grandmothers in the kitchen. And there's a sense of safety which comes with women looking after children. And at the same time, we know we must bring men into that space so that they can model what's it like to help a boy put his shoes on. And we can model the differences about men and women in schools in early years. So it would be helpful to just reflect on that together, is we're all trying to move this ahead, but I think it's a really fundamental one. And I guess another one was connecting to these community teaching and learning spaces, which are, I'm sure, all about women. What would it take to get men into those community environments where the focus is on women's health, women giving birth safely, women's knowledge, and yet we got to get men into that space too. So I think it would be great if we had a few more thoughts. I'd appreciate if someone else could think about this too with me. Thanks.
Anyone want to come in on that specifically? Barbara?
I don't know if I can answer that, but I can give you an example that I saw in Rwanda last year. It was fascinating. I work for a group called ABSI, and our group there is working with UNICEF to build these early childhood centers, and they've been very successful about it. So the moms have come, and that's been very interesting, because then the moms start to form groups. And then the moms started to form savings groups. And then the dads got all jealous. So we started to see the men coming to the center to form these savings groups as well. So I think you have to have something. First of all, jealousy is a very good thing. It moves people. What's going on there? There's something new. And they were interested enough to ask for themselves, to ask this for themselves. So there we saw that there had to be really something that where the men perceived an interest for them. And I think if we think a little bit more in those terms, that will help draw the whole community together.
Thanks. The other one data point I would put out, Promundo does a large State of the World's Fathers report every year. And one of the things that they find is that actually when fathers are engaged, it ups their level of satisfaction. And so there is, men are missing out by not taking on some of these caretaking responsibilities. So when you can find ways to engage them, I think there is kind of a virtuous cycle that can come into gear. And hopefully then the fathers will feel equally guilty as the mothers. I don't know if we get around guilt entirely, but it becomes more of a shared responsibility. Yeah. There are a few in the room. Jennifer?
Hi, everyone. Jennifer Rigg with the Global Campaign for Education US. Thank you for such a critical conversation that we're having here, and how can we keep this going outside of this room? Since you're asking for inputs and ideas from what we've seen, the youth engagement work and the community of practice on inclusive early childhood development and inclusive education that we've been doing and expanding at GCEUS, thanks to Anna in the back, Anissa and others. Plus, in a previous life, I was able to lead a venture fund that focused on ECD. And what we're finding more than anything is, we have to be starting at birth, if not before. Right? Because we know that there are so many amazing programs around the globe in multiple communities working on girls' education, primarily adolescent age groups, but that's actually much too late. And we know that not only are the gender norms often set, but the work that you all are doing is really helping people to realize that we can't wait until children are in school, or perhaps in some cases, for millions of children, they're still not making it to school, in part because of those biases and the discrimination and stigma beforehand. So the other piece that we have found as well is that there are so many factors at play, but early intervention across education, health systems, parenting, women's empowerment, et cetera, can make a huge difference. And I absolutely agree in terms of making sure all parents, all caregivers are actively involved. So, for example, not only gender, but disability. Is that young person living in a crisis setting or dealing with trauma? And also language. So many childcare providers often might actually be speaking a language that's not the national language themselves. So we need to make sure that we're thinking about how we reach and build that network of childcare providers. Thank you, Joan, for, as a working parent, making sure that we're also building it in a way that allows people to work and get a full days of work and hopefully without the guilt. But the earlier we can start, the better. And of course, we welcome anybody that would like to partner across the coalition, the small coalition we're already working with, and other networks. We'd very much like to help make sure that in the mobilization, the youth engagement, the work that we're all doing together, we're helping to make sure that we're being proactive in this way. Thank you.
Thanks. So I'm going to turn back to the panel, but there will be another moment for your engagement, and even another moment after that at the end for questions. So stay on your toes. So Samyukta, I want to turn now to this issue of teachers. So we've spoken a lot about parents, but in your research report and also this morning, you alluded to the fact that when you were observing classrooms, you saw some teachable moments that teachers missed out on, right? You saw gendered issues coming up in the classrooms and teachers not necessarily picking up on that and expanding the conversation. Can you talk a little bit more about what the opportunities are for kind of shifting that landscape around teaching, particularly given the limited teacher training that is currently happening in the sector?
When I talk about the Anganwadis in Delhi or across India, 1.3 million teachers in Anganwadis are all women. So to Nora's point about can we have, male teachers, it's women all the way, like the teachers, the people who supervise them. And that's how that ladder is, except at the top when there's a mix of men, or often there's a majority of men taking decisions for all the women. And in the education system too, I've seen rooms full of men taking decisions for girls and boys in school. So, that's, as a woman, it feels very strange that, one can assume that they really identify with all the issues, but one does wonder why there aren't more women in the room. And so with the teachers too, So the teacher sees her role as gender neutral. She doesn't see it as a woman who's bringing something to the table. This is what I have, taken away from observing them. And so she does a great job, but she doesn't have that lens on. In class, yes, there are these moments which come up, but she doesn't explore it because one, she's not wearing that lens, and the other that she thinks the children are too small, which is what many of us think. It's too early to start talking about these kind of issues. I mean, children, gender identities have just formed at age 2.5. Why do I need to get into all of this? And with teacher training, I've been part of the training that we do for teachers, and so early childhood care and education. There's a whole there are modules on that, and there's training around it. But training, there are bureaucratic delays in the training itself. But if you were to design what goes into that training, whenever that happens, then this aspect could be covered. So I'm optimistic about that. That's the other reason I'm optimistic about preschools expanding in schools, because I'm hoping that there will be male teachers and female teachers, because we see that in our school systems. Is that something that they can bring to the table? Is something that we need to look out for. But I think in general, teachers in schools thinking they're teaching the curriculum, and women in Anganwadis taking care of the children. We need to come to a middle path where everyone is agreeing on what we are teaching, how we are teaching it, and the fact that we bring our own personalities when we are teaching, our own lens when we are teaching. That needs to be recognized, but we're very early on in that. So.
My first comments to you was the tools that can come out of your report, because I think how you integrate those concepts that are in your report, the transformative nature of teacher education, still has to be developed now that you've documented that these are the issues. So we need tools on how to assess classrooms so that they're gender transformative, how to develop courses for teacher training I think you've just begun to document the issues. Now we need tools to transform it into practice.
Great. And then expanding beyond teachers and beyond parents to kind of the wider community. One of the things that I've been interested in lately and starting to see come out in the research is the impact of siblings. In the U.S. context, we often think about siblings, too many siblings having a negative effect on child development outcomes, but there have been some recent studies, for example, in Pakistan, which find that having an older sibling is actually predictive of better executive function. In Kenya, there's some research we've been involved in where they've looked at the composition of the household, and for young children who have older sisters in particular, they have better development outcomes. And the sort of hypothesis behind this is that siblings are actually playing an important caretaking role for their younger siblings and helping to stimulate their development in a way that's really important in some of these contexts. And so I would love to hear maybe Kim first from you in terms of what you've learned about the role of siblings and how you've played off of that in some of the work that Sesame does.
So through television, we do it mostly through modeling. I mentioned Zari, our young girl Afghan Muppet. She is 6 years old, and she was a really important representation of sort of what girls can be. And in the following season, she was introduced about 2.5, 3 years ago. In the following season, we introduced Zirak, her younger brother, who really looks up to her for many different reasons, because she loves to learn, she loves to go to school, she loves sports. And the intention for that is to, again, model those healthy behaviors. And the research that you were just citing, I love that, because it's very much in line with, I think, what the intent was around first modeling and making sure there was representation. Certainly that's not enough, but it's a really important entry point. In other ways, we include the broader families through community events. We often do a lot of mobile community viewings where it could be a refashioned apple cart or some sort of device with a solar-powered generator to power some whatever, a TV screen, so that communities with not a lot of infrastructure access to any kind of medium can watch the show. And so we include families to make sure that we're also getting at older siblings who can still benefit from the television show. Even though most of our television content is geared towards children 3 to 7, we know that older siblings are often watching. And so we tend to age our shows up to that older end of that spectrum, because if you make a television show for a 3-year-old, a 6-year-old is going to think it's too baby. But if you make a television show for a 6-year-old, they'll watch. They'll also encourage their younger brothers and sisters to watch. And so that's sort of the thinking around making content, to make sure that we're including the broader family.
You know, Dana, I don't know that research. I think it sounds really interesting. I think the thing that comes to mind when I think about siblings and gender, and I think we need to say gender, not girls, is that all over the world, girls are dropping out of school at 3rd grade to care for younger siblings. And so this childcare issue is an issue that's gender for the mother, but it's also a gender issue for the girls that can't go to school. I mean, I think if we looked at why girls aren't going to school in a lot of places, it's because they're caring for other siblings, younger siblings. And that has not been part of the education discussion as much as it needs to be.
And there's some other forthcoming evidence that I can't yet send you a citation for, but got a preview of. So, I mean, this is probably being recorded, but it is coming. But there's been some research done in India by an organization called Breakthrough, which works in middle schools to start to shift gender norms among middle school children. And what they're finding is that their intervention has been effective on shifting a bunch of norms, getting young boys, for example, to recognize that their sisters are taking on larger burdens in the household than they are, and actually starting to do more household chores. And other norms are starting to shift, but the one that's actually they have not seen movement on is caretaking. And so boys just view the caretaking so much as a girl and mother responsibility that it's much more stuck than some of the other gender norms. So that suggests that this could be a challenge for a longer period of time. Samyukta, do you want to add anything in terms of wider community and the role of the wider community in terms of shaping gender norms?
The only thing I really want to add is that sometimes it stems from what Arifaji just said. So, there's the sense of confidence, this lack of confidence that we have. Imagine a mother in rural India who cannot read and who has only seen this around her all her life. So it's like multiply what's happening in this room by that, all the sort of disadvantages that she is faced with. And so I think that, increasing that mother's level of confidence to say you can be a part of your child's learning and you can show the way, I think that requires some work. So for instance, in my organization, Pratham, what we are doing now is we go into communities in rural areas and we have these fairs, which we call school readiness fairs, but our condition is that there's only one condition, that the mom and the child have to come together. So that's the only way you can take part in the fair. And so the traditional people who are called, like the fathers and the grandfathers, they come in and say, hey, why can't we come? And we're like, no, this is for the mom and the kid. Because a mother knows her child really well, even though she may not be able to read. And for her to then realize that she can show the way, and then for the father to say, I want to do it too, it's a little bit like, maybe people are getting competitive, but increasing the confidence of the people with whom the child grows up. I think that plays a big role in what we actually do with the community. So for, mothers, if I give the example of literacy and numeracy, mothers used to say, hey, we can't read, so how do we know our children can read? And we used to say, do you know when your child has fever? And they'd say, of course we do. But you're not a doctor, No, I'm just saying, this is what we used to say to the mothers. So when your child is not well, but you're not a doctor to do that. You just know it. So if you know that your child is not learning, you don't have to be someone who can actually read a book, and yet there's so much else that you can do. So I think there's a lot around confidence building, going back to what everyone here was saying, that everyone comes with their own set of experiences, and one needs to build off that. So.
That's great. So again, opening it up to all of you, in your work and experiences, who have you seen as the key allies to bring in on this work to shift gender equity in preschools? Other thoughts from the audience? No, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm like hogging up all the questions. So I have a quick question because I work in the RBT field and like in early intervention with younger children.
What is RVT?
Registered behavior technician. Okay. So children with disabilities, autism mostly. And I find it funny that, not funny, but I find it interesting that usually mothers are the ones to meet with me afterwards to see the progress of their child. But I wish fathers would also be more involved, because I feel like children obviously feel that, and they understand that there's something lacking, and that's going to affect them, like you guys were saying before, throughout their lifetime. So I think there should be more, that, like Nora was saying, involvement of the male side of things as well. So I don't know if anyone can build on that.
Yeah, important theme. All the way in the back.
Hi, my name is Akshar. I work at JPAL. And I just wanted to add to something you said about the breakthrough study. I think there's a paper that exists which shows, that's already out there, which shows, I think, that girls who got access to the program changed attitudes a whole lot, but weren't able to change behaviors as much as boys were. And I think that really speaks to the importance of engaging men. But also, I think it's important to think about engaging men to change norms, but it's also important to, I feel like, think about who has more agency. And so and what are the levers for changing norms? And maybe engaging men is a more effective way to pursue that goal. And I think that's something that, that's worth thinking about.
Yeah. It's a good point. And I would add, as a footnote to that, though, that I have heard some concern among folks who think about women's empowerment around leaning into that fathers having more agency too much around realms where women have traditionally had more agency, and what the unintended consequences of that might be. And so just saying that is an opportunity and also a potential threat, and thinking about the ways that we do that without having unintended consequences.
Okay, it is on. Yes, okay. My name is Courtney. I am a student at American University studying international education and training. And I'm a previous Peace Corps volunteer and a Fulbrighter. And one of the things I wanted to just kind of put out there is something that I noticed through both of those experiences was the males that were in our group, that were going into the schools, that were working with the teachers in the host countries. And the reaction to that was both very positive and very negative for kind of what we were just talking about. In one side, the students were getting for the very first time to interact with a male in the classroom, which was huge. It was so beneficial in terms of students were coming to the male teachers and actually speaking to them. And because we were required to learn language, they were able to speak in their mother tongue to a male about issues for the very first time in a lot of ways in their school experience. So that's extremely positive. On the flip side, we had a lot of pushback from the host country educators saying, this is our space. This is our home. This is a place we have agency and we have control, and we want to keep it that way. So in terms of the double-edged sword, I think that is something to keep in mind, but I think it does open that door for especially young boys and males to see males in their lives in different roles. That was in Republic of Georgia and Taiwan.
Great. I think we had a hand at the back. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Alice Thomas from the Central Asia Institute. So in our programs in Tajikistan, where we're doing early childhood development programming, often it's the grandparents who are taking care of the children, just because there's so much immigration, particularly where we work in in GBAO, which is incredibly remote. There's absolutely no access to internet or Wi-Fi or anything like that. So I'm wondering, I mean, there's this very positive effect of these programs allowing women to work and then to migrate, because a lot of those women are migrating, but it's leaving grandparents behind, and I'm wondering what the research is showing about, how grandparents play a role in early childhood development.
Does anyone want to come in on? Yeah.
Yeah, we've seen that particularly in our work in South Africa, where there's a lot of, in the communities that we're working in, are single women-headed households. And oftentimes it is the grandmothers, because the jobs that mothers are able to get require them to be away from the home for extended periods of time. So oftentimes it is the grannies. And so that doesn't necessarily shift our approach, but it's to be more mindful of who is taking care of the child, right? To look at that ecosystem. And I'm just speaking from Sesame's point of view, but to make sure when we create this, being mindful of the enabling environment, the ecosystem of who is contributing to children's development, that focusing on biological father, mother is really a small percentage of the story. You have to look at aunties, whether by blood or by name, grannies, whatever constitutes who is determined to be family. We're very mindful in our representation and our language, with making sure that the tools and the quality of the content and the intervention remains the same. I don't know that I've answered the question, but we try to be as mindful of that as possible as well.
I turned to her at one point and said, what about men in the Anganwadi? And she talked about grandfathers to me, kind of. And I think all over the world, we're seeing more and more responsibility. Grandparents taking care of left behind children, quote unquote, left behind children. So I think this point that she's making about that it's about men, not about dads, we've got to keep reinforcing that, because father-mother is kind of a one view of the family. It's not the common view of a family. And so cross generations, I think, is particularly important.
If I could add something else, I think, too, it forces us to sort of remove it from the individual not participating fully in a child's life, rather than looking at the structure of toxic masculinity and how that interferes, right? I think there was a really memorable quote from a father in India when we did the play needs assessment. If you play with your child, in the quote, I will remember it verbatim, "Of course not. What would other people think?" Right? And so like that, the dangers of being an engaged parent in a system that does not support that, because there are some very serious consequences. You have to sort of remove it from this is an individual choice, and that these are structures within which people are operating, and there are very real consequences to them providing the nurturing care that we know the research says a child needs in order to be healthy in their first 1,000 days.
Yeah, just to add to that, that's so true. What will people think? Here, when I visited a preschool, I think near George Mason University, it was a private preschool, and the teacher told me, I let the children play with whatever they want. I have parents coming in and saying, why do you do that? Why did you let my son dress up in a princess's clothes? And then there's a whole economy around it, because it's a private preschool, if they withdraw the child, then there's money, there's so many other things that are, happening. So, there is a pushback there. But I think I just want us to think about one thing. In India, for example, I talked about gender-based violence, and on one hand, we see men as the perpetuators of, they perpetuate this violence against women. And on the other, and because there's that kind of violence, there are stringent laws coming in, whether it's at the workplace or anywhere else around, the kind of punitive measures you need to take if people do this, but actually it's read as if men do this. And on the other side, we're talking about, how do we imagine men as people who care and, want to take part. So there is, I think, there's a huge gap that we need to bridge here between toxic masculinity and positive masculinity, because a lot of people act out of fear. And so, for example, if you have a preschool teacher who's male, the people who take decisions are going to say, let's not get into that. I don't want to get into trouble with my 10,000 classes because of that one man who may just do something and there might be an accusation against him. So, I mean, what sort of environment do we want to create so that we can build this kind of caring behavior is something we need to think about.
Well, I was going to say this at the end, but I'll say it now because of you're mentioning the environment. The environment that we're in here, in India, in Brazil, around the world, is one of intolerance. And so we're here talking about gender equity, but the truth of the matter is there is racism that's very pervasive, and we have to combine this conversation with the fact that you can't be anti one kind of religion, whether you're in India or you're here, and be for equity and for equality. And I think combining the conversations, whether you're being prejudiced about children with disabilities, or because of the way somebody practices their religion, or because you're a girl or a boy, they're all the same intolerance. And that's the role of early childhood, is to try to transform that kind of thinking.
Great. I saw one more hand in the very back.
Hi, my name is Claudine, and I am a student at Mary Baldwin University, and I'm doing CDGL program. So my question is, girls' education. So you guys do mostly globally. So my question is, what is your research on, children who are in refugee camps?
Yeah, so in the past couple of years, in large part because of support from Bernard Van Leer Foundation, we have been supporting Syrians displaced by the Syrian civil war in Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Lebanon. Sesame has been working with displaced communities for many, many years, but that crisis and the displaced Rohingya living in Bangladesh are the two main displaced communities that we're serving right now. Gender is absolutely a component of that, as it's integral to every intervention we do. I'm not sure if there was a specific in terms of how we're approaching certain content areas.
I wanted to know if you guys do work with some refugees children, if you guys do have that program with refugees.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. I made your question much more complicated. I'm sorry.
There was also a major grant given by the MacArthur Foundation about a year ago, $100 million to IRC and Sesame.
No, because of the with Bernard Van Leer Foundation.
Okay, yeah. Great. So there has been sort of an uptick in interest in what happens in refugee contexts, particularly around education, which often gets left off the agenda. Nora.
Yeah, can I just add to that? That's an extremely important point to be raised, because it's provided an opportunity for the safe spaces for learning, which UNICEF does, and it allows for kind of a difference. Children need a safe space in the middle of crisis and conflict, refugee camps, and that can provide impetus to allow quite young children to be interacting with each other, not necessarily with the curriculum, but at least in a safe space and a learning intention. Education Cannot Wait, which is one of the biggest funds now designed specifically to address the needs of children in conflict and crisis, has a priority focus on early childhood. And one of the best examples is in Bangladesh, but there are others. And so it's something for us to look to. What are we learning from that? I'm really glad that was presented to us, and we need to be watching out for that in the next number of years as more funding comes into it, and we can start to collect examples of what's going on well.
Great, thank you. So I have one final question for each of our panelists, and then we will have a little bit more time for questions from all of you. I know we've been sort of intermixing the questions and comments, but it will have a little bit more time for further questions after this last one that I posed to the panelists, which is, given that we've been talking a lot about how do we begin to challenge gender stereotypes in early childhood, if if each of you were to write a book for 3 to 5-year-olds that could help to challenge gender stereotypes, they did get this question in advance, so I'm not springing it on them cold. What would your book be about? Can I start with you, Samukta?
Yeah, okay. So my book for the communities with which I work would be about stories from their own communities of people who can inspire and lead the way, men and women. I believe that, sometimes it's in our own history that the solution is embedded. And so to go back to, in my village, who did what, who are my heroes and heroines, and to be able to bring that out in a book for the children of that place is something that I would like to do.
Kim, do you want to go?
Similar to that, absolutely. I don't know that I would be the author of the book. I would pull from stories existing in communities. I think a lot of times in development, we make a lot of assumptions about what the story should be told without realizing that many of the stories exist. Communities are subverting gender norms in so many different ways that are not always obvious to us. So that's why it's really fundamental to see what stories the communities are already telling themselves, how to incorporate those sort of practices, how do they want to be represented, how are they subverting gender norms, how is gender defined in these contexts, right? Because how I define gender equality, how you might define it is very different than how communities that we also work in might be defining it. So I don't have a book, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Well, it's probably not one book, it's probably many books, right? And, for me, again, I think it's all about feeling good about who you are, but being able to accept everyone else. And it's that basic concept of child development that really is essential to early childhood, that we have to continue to reinforce so that there's more tolerance and understanding and appreciation for diversity.
Great, thank you all. So now I'm back open for any final questions from the audience. One back there.
Thank you. My name is Jess Sobin, and I work for Pratham USA, supporting the work that Samyukta does and other Pratham programming in India. But my question is, we are all convinced this is an issue, but what would be your suggestion, or what do you think the best strategy or key information to share with, these key stakeholders in early education would be in order to kind of convince them that gender transformative education should be happening in the early years? Because I think we, all see that in order for people to really change their behaviors and adopt new methodologies, they need to be convinced that there is a problem, and that acting differently will lead to better outcomes. And this is kind of a tricky issue to, to show that.
It's a really good question. I brought this report with me. Does anybody in the room, do you know this report on gender bridges? I assume somebody's...
Have you seen it, Nora?
Somebody's done it. Early childhood's not in here enough. And so I think one of the things we need to say to UNESCO is that when they do a report like this, reporting on gender equality, which is a fabulous report and exciting, that we have to start with integrating early childhood because we are part of the SDGs.
Sure.
Lucky I didn't answer it. It was from the GEM report guys saying, how are we going to shape the gender review for 2020? So I will say that.
Good.
All right.
I brought it. It's a great
And Nora,
report.
you've got some intergenerational stories to tell that came out in this panel as well.
Could I also add to that question? Sesame Workshop just published findings on a study done domestically on the role of identity and how that's influencing children's worldviews. Nationally represented sample of kindergarteners in the United States. And it wasn't just gender identity, but a whole host of identities. And I think what came out of that is very surprising is how early identity affects the way children view the world and the way that the world treats them. And I think that kind of research is really needed globally, around all sorts of identities, certainly gender, to say it's never too early to discuss this. I mean, it's fundamental that we are talking about gender identity at early childhood development.
Great. Question here.
Hi, my name is Shima, and I'm a GW alumni. I have a question for Kim. It's more related to the process of the work you do. How would you choose which communities in Afghanistan, for example, you would go as an international and Western organization, given that Afghanistan is very diverse and very large country? And do you go to communities that are already well established, sort of had relation with Western, people before? And if you go to areas that are totally untouched, they haven't been in contact with Westerners before, what are the challenges that you have to overcome with as an organization?
Yeah, this is a great question. So mass media is nationally available. In Afghanistan, it's available in Pashto and Dari, the two dominant languages of the country. For on-the-ground implementation, we really rely on the know-how of in-country implementing partners. We are content creators. We don't pretend to know cultural context. We don't know local communities in the same way that our implementing partners do. So we really rely on them to advise us on where are key entry points for us, where's the greatest need, and our implementing partners and our advisors really shape the direction of that. We truly do see it as a collaborative process. We create content to be implemented. If it can't be implemented effectively or it's not going to be received in any sort of impactful way, then we need to change our approach. And that's definitely how we see all of our work in Afghanistan and beyond.
Other questions? Okay, here.
Thank you. I think I have learned something that in my life that we have, as women, we have to take a little more assertive role and a little extra step to be there wherever we are at the end of our career or in the middle of our career. So probably in the early years, what do you think? Do we need to teach that from the preschool education? We need to teach them that you need this extra step. It will take very long to be there. So what is that assertive role we need to teach them there? Because I remember we tried to change our school's curriculum and we went there as a group of women and we faced a lot of problems. Even our cars were thrown with stones and they were very bad remarks written that they are trying to change the girls, but the girls want to change. So what do we do? I mean, these are the questions which even I cannot answer. So
we do need to take that extra step, but I feel we need to take it with the adults, so that what are we trying to do? We are trying to create an equal playing field. It's not like life is not going to be tough, but that extra step, like you say, that girls need to take, that's because there are disadvantages that they're surrounded by, and so it's that, what is that? How do we mitigate that? Is I think what we need to think about, and. In the early years, what we really need to actually focus on is a lot like what Joan said. To be able to treat each other as equal begins from right there. And so the people, why does life become more difficult for a girl? It's because the others don't, that you're not able to see people with that lens. So I think we need to start there, but the adults are the ones I would start with.
Great. Another in the far back.
All right. So my question is, what kind of advice can you give like to young people who are like immigrants and refugees who finish high school, but then they fear to go for college because of like bills that they have to help their family members to pay, or if they have to go to college, then they still fear about like the loans that they have to pay because they don't have any family history of income in the USA.
I'm not sure anyone on the panel has a lot of expertise at that level, but
Is your question about a gender disparity in that kind of issue?
So I'm talking about like issues of like young people who like, they wish to still continue their education, but because they family member, they cannot afford it. And since like girls' education objective is to help young people develop into better leaders, right? So like how can you help such young people?
Well, it's particularly hard for girls, right? Because traditionally they're the ones that have not had the support to continue their education. So I think it's a basic issue that we have to keep working on. But in this context, again, I think that we've got policies and public rhetoric that's not helping the issue. And I don't know what else I can say.
Kind of related to how we were talking about the importance of fathers, the research does show, I don't know this answering your question explicitly, but fathers are sort of the driving motivator for when girls finish school. And so, again, I don't know that this answers your question, but when we're looking at long-term effect of engaging fathers at early childhood level, fathers are often the reason why girls finish secondary and then often go on to tertiary. So again, I don't think it's answering your question directly if I understand it, but I do to tie it back to the earlier conversation we were having.
I think the question is what makes the change? I grew up in a family, first generation to go to college. Both my mother and father dropped out. And if it wasn't for my father being supportive of my education, I wouldn't be here. But, I often think about what was it about him that he made that leap from believing that I should go to college when someone else would not. And, I don't think I have an answer to that, except for he wanted his family to move up. And, but you have to get over a gender stereotype, right, to do that.
There was one? Yes, go ahead.
So I'm now very aware it's almost the end of the panel, and I'm going to do the typical male thing of having the final word, which was not what I intended at all. I think there's a fragility point which I think has been touched on, which is really important, and I don't think we've touched on enough across the day actually about girls' education and fragility in that particular context, and it's really good that it's been raised at all. I think that's really, really important. I'm just thinking about role models and whether it's Louis and Elmo or the male teachers or whoever it is, that I don't think we have enough, and I don't think whether that's in the education space, the family space, the leadership space, I think that makes such an impact, whether it's on the screen or in day-to-day community life. But I don't know if there's any that you, the panel, can think of. Are there prominent go-to role models that we can point young people to? And to reinforce what's been said, this is not a developing country issue. This is everywhere. And I've got a nearly 3-year-old son, and I sort of live it day to day as his primary caregiver as well. So I see it day in, day out, and I worry about calling his toys he or she or which one is which, and making sure we're doing that right. And I get the sort of the joy when he refers to the pilot as she rather than he in his sort of wooden toy set. But I don't feel like we have enough role models out there to make as much change as we want to make. So how can we cultivate that as leaders, and I suppose in our arena ourselves? Because I think that can make such an impact. And that's not just on early childhood, that's across women's economic empowerment, that's across girls' education, that's across this space, but it feels particularly prominent in this space. And to reinforce, this starts so early. I mean, I think the slides that you presented earlier were brilliant, but yeah, I think you said at one stage it was as early as 6. I think it's far before 6. I think it's really, really early on that those perceptions are being cultivated and made. But thank you, it's been really, really powerful and instructive.
Great. Do you want to?
Yeah, we actually have some research on where parents look for role models for their children on TV, and it's mostly through children's television shows, but the characters overwhelmingly are kind and help other people. Spider-Man, because he helps people in need. Batman, because he helps people in need. Again, there's a theme, right? It's all male superheroes, and there are issues there, but sort of thinking about what are the characteristics for role models that parents can find on TV, particularly when there is not a lot of media for children to consume. That was very promising to us in terms of kindness, healthy relationships, helping others, how that can then translate to modeling positive parenting behaviors and nurturing care among fathers and other male caregivers. We're still figuring out beyond Louie and Elmo, and I love that you already figured that name, so if that's all you remember from me today, I think my colleagues will be very happy with me.
Great. Well, I hope you all will join me in thanking our panel. And I want to thank all of you for being a very active and engaged audience. Kim sort of whispered to me I could go all day, and it's true. This is a great discussion. Thank you all.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.